Hello. It is a pleasure to be back at NASIS. It's been 7 years, and it is an extra treat for me that the conference is being held here in Montreal because this is where I grew up. Thank you for inviting me to speak. This is a talk about gazetteers, and in particular, the gazetteer that I work on called Who's On First. Who's On First has set itself the ambitious goal of global coverage ranging from continents all the way down to venues everywhere. For anyone not familiar with the term gazetteer, it's basically just a big phone book, but a big phone book of places rather than people. And gazetteers have existed for as long as we've been able to conceptualize place. A gazetteer is so deceptively simple as to seem mundane beyond effort, and so feverishly complex the moment you scratch the surface as to overwhelm the best of intentions. This is not a talk about the mechanics of Who's On First. In the 2.5 years since the project began, something on the order of 40 to 50,000 words have been written about the architectural theory and the engineering decisions and the challenges we faced along the way. This is not a talk about how we work on a gazetteer like Who's On First, but rather why we work on it at all. So if not how, but instead why, we still need to start with what. What is the shape of the Who's On First gazetteer? To begin with, Who's On First is an openly licensed data set. At its most restrictive, data is licensed under a Creative Commons attribution by license. As much as possible, and this is true of our own day-to-day work, data is licensed under a Creative Commons 0 public domain license. Every record in Who's On First has a stable, permanent, and unique numeric identifier. There are no semantics encoded in the IDs. At rest, every record is stored as a plain text GeoJSON file. One of our goals is to ensure that Who's On First embodies the principles of portability, durability, and longevity. And so this led us to adopt plain vanilla text files as the base unit of delivery. Those files are stored in nested hierarchies of directories, each of which is derived from its own ID. There are a common set of properties for all records, which may be supplemented by an arbitrary number of additional properties specific to that place. Likewise, there are a finite number of place types in Who's On First, and all records share a common set of ancestors. As with properties, hierarchies can be as complex as circumstances demand, but there is a shared baseline hierarchy across the entire data set. Individual records may have multiple geometries, sometimes multiple hierarchies, and sometimes both. Records may be updated, superseded, cessated, or even deprecated. However, once a record is created, it can never be replaced or removed. Finally, and most importantly, Who's On First is meant by design to accommodate all of the places. Who's On First is not a carefully selected list of important or relevant places. It is not meant to be the threshold by which places are measured. It is instead meant to be the raw material by which a multiplicity of thresholds might be created. From Who's On First perspective, the point is not that one place is more important or more relevant than any other. The point is not that a place may or may not exist, and the point is not that the place's legitimacy itself may be in dispute. The point is that these places exist, and critically, that people believe these places to exist. And that is why sometimes I refer to Who's On First as a gazetteer of consensual hallucinations. To explain why, I'm going to start with this guy. This is Leonard Cohen, the poet and musician who died in November of last year. Cohen was born and raised in Montreal, and this mural was painted on Saint Laurent Boulevard, just down the street from where he kept a house in the city. Saint Laurent Boulevard is often referred to by locals simply as the Main. The Main is so called because it is one of the city's oldest streets, running along a north-south axis starting in Old Montreal at the bank of the St. Lawrence River. And like a lot of cities in the world, Montreal's north-south axis has no bearing in reality. If you want to be precise, Saint Laurent Boulevard runs along a north-northwest to south-southeast axis. What's important about the Main is less its directionality than the fact that it acts as the border between the eastern and western halves of the city. It is also only in recent years that the Main has not served as the dividing line between the city's English and French-speaking populations. This was famously described by the author Hugh McClellan in the larger Canadian context as two solitudes living side by side with little or no common ground between them. It is also not really possible to talk about that divide without talking about it as the border between the haves and the have-nots. This conference is being held at the southern edge of what was once known as the Golden Square Mile. This part of town is where what we now call the 1% lived. For a time, this was the seat of pretty much, and I mean all of it, pretty much all the wealth and power in Canada. It was very, very English at a time when the contempt and the disdain between the English and the French was barely contained and rarely disguised. And so this created a power dynamic that rippled down to every aspect of society in the province, in a province that has always been 90% Francophone. It was a power dynamic that was not only allowed to fester, but one that was actively promoted. And this continued to varying degrees until round about the 1950s and what is called the Quiet Revolution, when the French-Canadian population demanded, not for the first time, that they be allowed to be maîtres chez nous, or masters in our own home. Some of you may have noticed that the conference hotel sits on a street named after a guy named René Lévesque. And it is difficult to overstate Lévesque's role during the Quiet Revolution and in shaping contemporary life and the social contract in Quebec. Lévesque would be elected premier of the province in 1976 as head of the separatist Parti Québécois and would lead an unsuccessful bid to secede from Canada in 1980. Among other things, he gave Quebec a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms before Canada had one, and language laws which are still being debated to this day. By the time he died in 1985, though, few would deny him, whatever they thought of his politics, his place as the father of modern Quebec. So you will be forgiven for wondering why we have chosen to honor such a celebrated figure with such an unremarkable boulevard. I encourage you to take a moment the next time you go outside to marvel at its mediocrity. It's anyways. The answer lies in what Boulevard René Lévesque used to be called. Boulevard René Lévesque used to be called Dorchester Boulevard, after the English Lord Dorchester, who was formerly known as Lord Durham. Lord Durham was sent to Canada in 1838 to report on the Patriot rebellions of the previous year, and more generally to determine why the Queen's French-Canadian subjects were getting restless. Fun fact, the rebellions were led by Louis-Joseph Papineau, who we have also honored with an equally drab and uninspiring avenue about a 40-minute walk from here, if you're interested. Lord Durham's report might have faded into historical obscurity had its author not offered the opinion that the French Canadians, who predated the first English settlers by 100 years or more, that they were, and I quote, un peuple sans histoire, or in English, a people without history. So it is not for nothing that all the license plates in this province now read, Je me souviens, or I remember. Nor is it surprising that Dorchester Boulevard was purposely renamed to honor René Lévesque. But you know who else remembers? The city of Westmount remembers. Westmount is an autonomous municipality on the island of Montreal. It's about a 20-minute walk from here. and home to whatever money and power that didn't immediately decamp to Toronto following the election of René Lévesque. Westmount is sort of a leftover bronze square mile of wealth and privilege, and in 1987, it refused to rename Dorchester Boulevard when the rest of the city did, and so it remains today. Fun fact about Westmount, Leonard Cohen was born there in 1934. And so we're back to this guy. By the time Leonard Cohen died in Los Angeles, he had lived there for decades. Whatever connection Cohen kept with the city of Montreal, he was, for all intents and purposes, an Angelino. This pesky fact has never prevented anyone in Montreal, French or English, from claiming him as one of their own. For many people, Leonard Cohen is, before all else, a Montrealer. So it is in all seriousness that I would like to propose that the city of Montreal rename Saint Laurent Boulevard after Leonard Cohen. The simple fact is that Montreal suffers from a surplus of streets and plazas and landmarks devoted to the religious and linguistic power struggles and score settling of the past. We are overdue something that reflects the present, and we are overdue a celebration. And I've told you all of these stories for two reasons. The first is that these things really happened, and they are the stories that inform the city that you'll be visiting during this conference. And the second reason is to use the telling, and in particular the telling of a duality, of this idea of two solitudes or two founding nations, to highlight an uncomfortable fact about Canadian history, French and English both. And it is that, simply put, we have been blind to the fact that there has always been another story, blind to the fact that the First Nations were already living here on these lands long before the European settlers arrived. And it is important to recognize that we have not been passive in our blindness, but we have been brutally deliberate. First out of malice, and then later out of negligence, and more recently out of shame. We have closed our eyes to the fact that almost from the beginning, we have systematically worked to erase the First Nations, hoping only to open our eyes when the deed is done, and there is nothing left to remember but the two solitudes. In 2017, there is at least a nascent awareness, something approaching acknowledgement among Canadians, that these things happened and that we did them. We are a long, long way from making amends, and there is not time enough to catalog the ways that we have done wrong by the First Nations. But I would like to touch on one story in particular. As late as the 1950s and the 1960s, it was, as part of the official government policy to assimilate the First Nations, our practice to forcibly remove the children from First Nations families. These children were placed in foster homes or residential schools, where in addition to widespread physical and sexual abuse, they were actively prevented from learning or practicing or remembering their language, their culture, their histories, and in many cases, their birth names. If you believe that place is history, or that language is culture, or that naming things is an important form of agency, things that are the very stuff of map-making, then it is difficult not to see these policies as anything but a sanctioned and premeditated erasure. I take the view that the sins of a mother or a father are not those of their sons and daughters. We have enough experience in the past to suggest that when we do assume such a thing, nothing good comes of it. I do not, however, believe that those same sons and daughters should be allowed to abdicate the past. The past, I am sorry to say, is our burden. It is our burden because while the stories I've told you today have taken place in a comparatively modest slice of geography to a comparatively minuscule population, they are the same story everywhere you go. The details may change, but the story is always the same. If there is one common thread that binds us all, it is that we argue about what to call a place, and we argue about the meaning of those names. If there is another common thread, it is, unfortunately, that we assume the argument is a zero-sum game. So what if we stop doing these things? I have described to you a series of overlapping grievances and past injustices that in no way will a gazetteer remedy alone. A gazetteer is simply a tool. But perhaps we can stop teaching our tools the bad habits of the past. A gazetteer is fundamentally about the relationship of one place to all the other places. In the past, we have been limited by economics and by physics and by no shortage of myopia in the kinds of relationships a gazetteer might afford or allow. And the hope and the goal of the Who's on First project is that the present has afforded us the opportunity to leapfrog many of these limitations. We live in a time when the technology around us has begun to take on a foul-smelling odor. But I think it is worth remembering that the technology still offers some dim light if we choose to use it for something good. The hope and the goal of Who's on First is not that everyone should have to, or even want to, add their names and stories to our gazetteer, but only that they may be able to do so when they choose to. The hope and the goal is in the chance to allow the agency to name the places that define their own stories, and in doing so, to give them a shared weight and mass in the universe, without needing to erase someone else's telling in the process. Thank you.